one way or the other.
That's very true. Hopefully it goes off okay today.
Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Morning, Carol. Morning, Brian. Morning, Yvonne.
Good
Hi,
morning.
Teddy. How are you?
Good morning. Morning.
Diane said they're getting set up, Teddy, and Mark had brought an extra laptop, so they're working on that right now.
Okay. Yeah, and I was gonna go there, but I don't feel the greatest today, so I figured I'd stay away from people.
Yeah.
I had my COVID booster day before yesterday. I was down all day yesterday, not feeling good, but
So I went in for a flu shot on Tuesday, and
yeah.
we'll have the COVID booster too. I'm like, I'm not doubling up.
I did them both on Tuesday, and I slept yesterday quite a bit. But today I feel fine.
I hear them now.
Mm. There's our room.
By the settings, I'll give you.
Get microphone.
There you go. Yeah, you do. I think it's, yeah. Shouldn't go to sleep on. Right there again.
The folks online hear us in the room.
Yes.
You guys.
Yes.
Stop talking about us now.
Well, should you guys want to zoom in on somebody talking in the room? This is a little note that you can angle it in whoever you'd like. There's this little button. We'll pop you back to the wide angle.
All right.
You did that.
Thank you. Where's Mark? Give him all the back.
I said, we're in trouble if I'm the one that's going into that.
Is he coming here? Okay. Yeah, it's tough now. You gotta figure out travel. I didn't even know it's not just sit down. Oh, it's 1 minute.
I know it. We left way too early. I got it about 20 to 9, but.
Oh no, Teddy's there? Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah.
I'm here.
Asked to do a little 5-minute
Thanks, Mark.
intro, but let me know if you want me to do that in here. Otherwise, I can go hop on the Teams link too.
Okay.
No, you can be in there. I think it's good.
Might be. Yeah, I think so.
Does anybody want to do
Pardon? I don't want that.
Diane, should we go ahead and get started, or
I already contributed.
Sure.
Carol, do you want to go ahead and do the roll call?
Oh, I'm going to do the roll, Teddy.
You are? Okay.
All right. Teddy McKelly, here.
And virtually here.
I better make that a note of that, huh? Yvonne Caravel,
Here.
Nolan Cowden, Steve Fensky,
Morning.
Steve Georgie, Jason Hollanday, who's that? Mark Johnson,
Morning here.
Brian Cranbeer,
Good morning.
Micah Myers, Phil Stahlberger. I think Phil was traveling. Teresa Sunday is on vacation. Jim Wakeham,
Here.
Paul Wertz. I think Paul was on vacation too. Dave Wolf.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay. I'll go back to the ones that didn't respond the first time. Nolan Calvin, Dee Georgie, Jason Hollanday, Micah Myers, Bill Stahlberger, Teresa Sunday, Paul Wertz. Well, we have 7, so we don't have a quorum, but I don't think we're voting on anything today anyway.
Go ahead and get started. First of all, I think we have some of you there face to face. I apologize I couldn't be there. I'm a little bit under the weather. Woke up this morning not feeling the greatest. So, but and you'll hear it in my voice. But hopefully we'll get through the next hour. We got a packed agenda, and it's we're trying this hybrid thing. We did all virtual. Virtual we had it working. Hybrid and all just from work. It's challenging. So we'll see how that goes from noise and switching and presenting and all that. But as far as agendas today, right after this sort of review of the agenda, we'll do approval of the minutes. And then Nicole will give us an update on the Minnesota Humanities Center, which everybody that's there in person is at that location. Ashley Littlehit will be doing an FCC mapping update. She's a vice president from Geoanalytics. We'll have a digital equity presentation from Hannah Buckland. She's part of the new office of the Broadband Task Force on digital equity. We'll take a break after that. And Diane will give us an update on any new news from Office of Broadband Development, and then we'll go in the update of the 2 working groups or the sub and some final notes. So again, I'm assuming we'll get a lot about 12 p.m., maybe a little bit after that will be the length of the meeting for today. So with that, first thing is the minutes from this past meeting in July we had in August 29th, as well as we did not get approval of the minutes from July 13th, so we'll do them both at the same time. Any questions, comments, or concerns from the minute past 2 meetings? Okay, not hearing anything from anyone online or anybody in the room, so we'll mark the meeting minutes as approved. Okay, with that, Nicole, maybe I'll turn it over to you to just give us a quick overview of the Minnesota Humanities Center.
Sure. Welcome to everybody in person. Welcome online. My name is Nicole McMahon. I'm our Event Center Director and have been here 18 years. Christine asked me to talk a little bit about how we're using technology and broadband and how that's pivoted and changed during COVID. Obviously, like the rest of the world, we had to pivot the way we do our work. We're not only a full-service event center, we're actually a nonprofit event center and a nonprofit organization. So our vision is to create a just society that is connected, curious, and compassionate. And we do that through K-12 professional development, public humanities programs, lots of different initiatives. So we had to take all of that work and do our own work and pivot that and go digital during COVID. And a lot of the communities we work with are marginalized communities, and we do work with them and in the community. So we had to also make sure that it was accessible to all of those people. So not only did we go digital, but we opened our doors here and made sure that if they didn't have access to our programs, that they could come here and at least be part of that virtual audience in our own center too. So we work hard to make sure that our programming was free during COVID. We're just now getting back into the habit of charging for that again. And then in the event center too, I've been in the meeting industry a long time, and hybrid was always not really a thing people wanted to do. Now it's a part of, I'd say, 60% of our meetings, such as yours today. And we work with mostly nonprofits too and government agencies. So something I'm doing to keep our prices down and keep our doors open and our clients coming back is we don't charge for any of our AV we never have. but especially with hybrid, we're investing in equipment that is working, trying new things, but essentially we want to be able to offer that to touch more people and to keep our doors and our prices down. So that's something, like you have set up today, something that we're doing and pivoting, and it's here to stay. As much as, we all love meeting in person, it has pros and cons. That need to connect is never going to go away. But it also opens up accessibility for people who might not be able to be here today. So we see the value in that. So we, as an organization and nonprofit, are investing in that to make sure that we can keep up with the times and keep our doors open and keep our programming and our meeting space accessible for all. Let me know if any of you have any questions. Otherwise, welcome to our building in person. I'm sorry you guys couldn't be here. It's a beautiful historic building. We just got done renovating, and we actually incorporated that into our renovation too. We have some Zoom pods. We have new office area that we set up for hybrid as well. So that was part of our pivoting and renovation plans as we went under construction during COVID.
Cool. But how many events do you host in a given year?
Typically here, we host around 350 events.
Wow, fantastic.
And have about 10,000 to 12,000 people come through the doors every year.
Impressive. Nice work.
Yeah, thank you.
Very nice. You made it very easy for the technology to work too.
Yeah. And if you have if you have any problems with this microphone, we also have 2 wireless handheld mics that we can set up. That makes it easier for you guys online to hear. So we're kind of experimenting with different things and seeing which works the best. So let me know if you guys have any questions, or come grab me if you have any technical problems during your meeting.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. We appreciate you having us there at the center. And yes, it's all working, so that's very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Awesome. Okay, moving on to our next topic for today. We do have Ashley on, Ashley from the Vice President of Geoanalytics at Connected Nation, going to give us an update on the FCC mapping efforts. So Ashley, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
All right, perfect. So I'm here today to give an update on some of the broadband mapping activities at the state level, as well as some of the things that are going on federally, especially with the FCC, and how that's going to impact some of the state level activities. So just a quick outline, just a very brief background on some of the Minnesota broadband mapping as far as what's been happening, what's going on right now, and how will that change moving forward. Looking at the federal changes that are going to have local impact, talk about several different programs, including the FCC Broadband Data Collection, or BDC, the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, which is more commonly just referred to as the Fabric, and then the NTIA BEAD program for the BEAD, or Broadband Equity Access Deployment, how all of these things are going to impact Minnesota in terms of looking at broadband, eligible areas, unserved locations, and how we can move forward on all of those different parts. Then want to look at what's next, because there are going to be multiple challenge processes. Some of that have already started. And then there's going to be updated Minnesota broadband mapping. How does all of the things going on federally, how is that going to impact the state itself? Looking at BEAD program support moving forward, and then I'll open it up for some Q&A. So jumping right in terms of Minnesota broadband mapping, the first Minnesota broadband maps were done in 2008. And we worked very closely this entire time with the Office of Broadband Development. We've been working very closely with Diane Wells for this entire stretch of time in terms of getting broadband maps created, working with the provider communities, the trade associations, to make sure that there's as much participation as possible, that we're answering those questions, doing field validation, and just working really closely with the providers and with the state to make sure that we're getting all of these components in place to be able to produce the most accurate, detailed broadband maps possible. After those initial broadband maps were created, that is when the State Broadband Initiative was then launched. And so for a 5-year period, there were 2 submissions of data a year from 2010 to 2014, being able to work directly with NTIA on those submissions, what the funding and the process flow looked like. And then after that, Minnesota was one of the almost few states at the time that continues regular broadband mapping activities, as well as the border-to-border grant program, which has certainly been held up as a model for states to follow as far as identifying areas that are unserved, doing detailed broadband mapping, and getting places connected that have been previously overlooked. So Minnesota has definitely been at the top of the states that have been doing broadband mapping and doing it very well in terms of how a state can use this information for the benefit of residents. And so just to give an idea of kind of how Connected Nation, how we approach broadband mapping activities, we have kind of this four-pronged approach to try and be as holistic as possible as far as the data collection, review, and validation of the information. So our team is doing a lot of independent research, pulling together several different data sources, databases, permitting, county level information, and then just literal research on the providers that exist, new providers to the market, where have mergers and acquisitions taken place, what speeds are available, keeping up with different technology types on our engineering side so that we know when we see certain data come in, we know if it's valid, we know if we need to question it or investigate further. Second is going to be those provider relationships. Several members of the engineering and technical services team that we have been broadband providers previously, and so they know about the network setups, they know what providers struggle with in terms of operations, how they maintain data, because everybody maintains it differently in terms of their operations and what they can physically provide as far as saying, here's my service area, or here are the addresses I can possibly serve. And so those relationships have been really strong in Minnesota, especially since the relationships have been in place for so many years. And so even as people have retired or there's a turnover, we've been able to maintain those relationships, which has gathered more data and higher participation rates because of those relationships that have been built. The third part is going to be field validation, where we are physically going in the field and validating, making sure that the data we've received, make sure those service areas are where they said they were, the technology is the right kind, the speeds that have been reported are the right ones, and seeing if what changes and revisions need to be made to that information. And so that field validation has kind of two components, one for the broadband mapping itself, and then there's another specifically for the border-to-border grant program, and I'll show some examples of that here in a minute. But being able to have more transparency as far as when state and or federal funds are going to providers to expand broadband into certain areas, making sure that that area matches up with what area they applied for, or did the provider come into any challenges or issues as they were going to build out to an area and they found out, hey, based on the ground, we physically can't bury fiber here and we need to change things up. So having that layer of field validation, not only for transparency, but also that confidence level of knowing that services are physically where we believe they are on that map. So we can then use that to better define which areas are unserved and underserved, and then make those funds available, or have a focus on how do we work with the local providers to come in and build into these areas that have been previously overlooked. And then that fourth component is going to be resident feedback. So anytime maps are published, there's constantly a feedback loop both through the Office of Broadband Development as well as through the interactive map that's available. So if somebody searches their address and it provides a list of providers who should be offering services applications, if that information is wrong or there's a discrepancy, it can get submitted back to us so we can review that, make some confirmations, work with the provider, and then make those refinements on the next iteration of the broadband map. So now I've just got a few just quick screenshots of the map. This is the Minnesota Interactive Broadband Map. If you are not familiar with it, the layer that's turned on right now is just looking at the maximum advertised download speed. And so the darker the color, the higher the speed that is available in that area based on the data that has been collected. And so the lighter areas and the areas without color that doesn't just look like the base map, those are going to be areas that do not have service of at least 25 by 3. And so using that currently as the kind of baseline of federal broadband definition, but then certainly looking at URL's 100 by 20 definition, which is likely to become the new federal definition at some point, probably soon. So being able to take that information, aggregate it from all the providers to then flip it and look at the inverse, and then focus where it's areas that don't actually have the service. We've also been working very closely on the border-to-border grant program, and so tracking not only the applications and where areas are unserved and therefore eligible for the grants, but tracking things that are in progress, tracking things as they're complete, and then the image on the right being able to show where, generally, where have projects been awarded over the course of the grant program itself, and being able to track that year by year to know where funds are going, where has the impact been made, how many households are now connected because of this funding that is going to areas that need it the most, and doing a lot of work on the grant program itself. And then, as I mentioned, some of the field validation activities where we have engineers that are going out looking for that evidence of the new assets and new infrastructure that is being built, being able to run tests on that, meeting with technicians from the providers out in the field to just talk about the project and the actual build out that has happened, and then being able to create some maps like what's on the right, where the orange is the application area where the provider said, hey, I'm going to use that funding to serve this area, and then having our engineers drive throughout that area, documenting all of that evidence that now exists as far as where services are now available to make sure that we are confident that the funding was used the way it was supposed to be used, and being able to report back to OBD on that type of information as well. So moving now to look at some of the federal changes that are going on as far as the local impact. Again, we're going to look at 3 different programs, first being the FCC, the Broadband Data Collection, the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, and then also the NTIA BEAD program that'll be coming up. So looking at those 3 very specific topics a little bit. Starting with the FCC, the Broadband Data Collection, we are very closely following all of that information. From the Broadband Data Act of 2020, the FCC has been funded and directed to produce a much better federal data set that looks at broadband technologies and speeds across the country. What has been collected was known as Form 477 filings. Those are still continuing at the same time as this new broadband data collection until at some point in the future, perhaps the 477 unsetted, and then the BDC data collection is much more granular, much more focused on actual locations of where broadband services are available. And so this is a huge program that is just now getting started. The very first filing was due this past September 1st. And so really being able to bring all of those components, all the frustrations that have existed with the federal data sets over the past several years, now being funded and activated through the new broadband data collection. So there's 2 components of it. One, looking at the broadband service areas, providers are allowed to submit one of 2 different data types. One being a polygon service area that any location, any household within that polygon or that shape should be able to get that service by whatever technology and whatever speeds that provider is reporting. The second option they have, and it's an either or, they can't submit both types of information. So they can either submit that shape or that geospatial file of their service area, or they can submit this address list. Which addresses could you service within 7 to 10 days if somebody called up and said, hey, I'd like to be a customer? So you can either or that type of submission, and that really depends on the type of data and how providers maintain that information within and on their own networks. And so with that address data, there's got to be an underlying data set to actually produce that from, something that's consistent across the country. So if there are 5 providers that serve 123 Main Street, everybody agrees where 123 Main Street is physically located. Because you may have noticed if you've used Google Maps, Bing Maps, any other number of address locators, you might get some variation. Some of them are very consistent on showing that address right on the rooftop. You can see it on the building if you zoom in far enough. And some of them kind of get a little bit further apart. Some of them might be where the driveway is or where the street address is. And so this data set that's going to underpin all of the broadband data collection will be consistent across the board. If somebody says they serve 123 Main Street, all of those show up at the exact same location, and hopefully it is on that rooftop because that is what it's aiming to do. And I'll show a couple pictures of that here in just a second. So in terms of the broadband data collection itself, this is just a screenshot from the BDC website on the FCC, where basically they've been moving through several processes on getting the rules and requirements ready, building this new portal that will allow providers to upload this data, deciding how the challenge process is going to work, providing technical assistance to providers that need it, and then moving into these challenge processes. So we're actually getting closer to the end here of this diagram as far as being able to really launch the systems, launch a new broadband map nationally. And so that initial data deadline, providers had to submit information to the FCC portal on September 1st. They will have to do that again on March 1st. And so it's going to be every 6 months where data is submitted, and it's going to be data current as of June 30th for that September 1st filing. And then when December 31st of this year hits, providers will report by March 1st of next year what their networks look like at the end of this year. And so there's a little bit of a lag between all these different, when does the data current as of versus when does it have to be submitted by, and bringing all of these different components together. And so what we've heard so far is that the FCC is anticipating perhaps a mid-November release of this new national broadband map using the data that was submitted in early September. We have heard that there are a lot of concerns, there are a lot of issues with some of the data sets that exist, and providers have a lot of concerns about the accuracy of that underlying fabric or address data as far as what it makes their network and system look like. So there are concerns with that. Kind of have an asterisk on this mid-November, just from the things I've heard the past couple of days, that ideally it's still going to be in November, but it looks like there are some challenges just with the FCC working back and forth with providers that have had concerns about what their surface area looks like compared to the address fabric. So definitely more to come. We're going to be watching that very closely. So to give an idea of the broadband serviceable location fabric, how does that compare to the address mapping or the census block mapping, service area mapping, all of these different components that have happened over the course of the year. So the image here that we're looking at is looking at two census blocks. So let's see if I can point to it on the screen. So we've got these purple areas. You can kind of see this purple line here. This area is a single census block where we can kind of see a neighborhood, and this other area is another entire census block, so much, much larger. And generally the more rural an area is, the larger the census blocks are. So when providers were having to report using the Form 477 to the FCC, they were reporting census blocks. So even if they just served one house within this area, that census block ID was getting filed. But you didn't know exactly, was it, you serve one house, you serve all the houses, what percent? There wasn't enough detail. What Connected Nation had typically done is we focused on the service area. We said, hey, telecom networks have nothing to do with census block boundaries. Let's focus on where you serve. And so we would work, and still are working with providers to more precisely identify what's your service area. And so being able to outline a provider saying, hey, we serve this neighborhood, and what does that look like? And we can get more detailed and precise, whether they say any location within that area I can physically serve. Fantastic. That's what we need to know. And when we switch to the fabric locations, what we're doing is pinpointing the rooftop of every address location that should get broadband service. And so the yellow triangles, just as an example, showing across the board where are the houses located within those two census blocks we showed in purple originally. And then when we are able to overlay it with the actual service areas, being able to then categorize each place as, is it served in green or is it unserved in red? Because now we're getting closer to what we need as far as precisely identifying locations that need the assistance, that need funding, that need expansion efforts to actually occur. And so then when we bring that all together, now we can see just how overstated the census block data was, because you have all those red triangles that are showing locations that actually are not served, but under the previous model were listed as served. And this also helps providers do better cost modeling estimates moving forward. Instead of what had previously happened was, for some of the federal subsidy programs, the FCC might have said, oh, hey, we think there's 100 locations in this area that need to be served. And providers would have to do cost modeling or do bids in an auction to say, oh, yeah, we'll spend X number of dollars to reach those people. And then they get out there and realize 100, the estimate of 100 is completely off. And it could be way below, it could be way above. And then not having enough detail on, okay, well, are the houses clustered together? Are they very spaced apart? Are the houses right off of the main street? Does everybody have a half-a-mile driveway? All of those different things play a role in how much it's going to cost to expand broadband to these locations. And so being able to very precisely identify all of those locations gives everybody the information they need to not only say, okay, here's definitively where the areas are that are unserved and underserved, but now what is it going to take to actually connect the people that are still unserved? So now moving to the BEAD program, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment. That is the program from NTIA. And so there's $42.45 billion focused on infrastructure. States were able to submit those initial applications in August as far as saying that they are definitely going to be participating in this. All 50 states did submit those. There's going to be formula-based grants that are going to be going to states. And the biggest part here is that the allocations state by state are going to be calculated using the FCC broadband data collection data. So NTIA did just recently announce that they are going to not use this first iteration of the new BDC data, but hold off a little bit because we have heard some of the concerns from providers, from states about the fabric, about the BDC data filing itself. And so want to make sure that there is another round of this before those allocations are made, hopefully getting the data to a better spot before using that to identify, oh, how many unserved locations are there in each state, because that is going to impact how much funding the state actually gets. And so once that does happen, the states will then administer the funds through a competitive sub-grant process. Minnesota is certainly in a really great shape because as having done the border-to-border broadband grant program for all of these years, you all already have a framework in place to do this. There are a lot of states that are just now setting up a broadband office at the state level that have not been doing any broadband mapping, and so they are at a significant disadvantage to be prepared for all of these programs that are coming out. So definitely very excited for Minnesota's position as a leader here. A couple more things on the BEAD program. States are going to have a shot clock. Once given the funding, there's different plans that have to be put together over the next couple of years. And then the broadband infrastructure law itself actually defines some of the priorities as far as which areas are the most important to try and focus on first. And so those are going to be the locations that are unserved at that 25/3 definition, trying to build up those areas first. Then looking at the locations that are underserved, meaning they may have some level of service of at least 25/3, but it doesn't quite meet 100/20. And so that's going to be kind of the second layer of priority. And then also looking at community anchor institutions that don't have at least 1 gig service. And so those are the defined priorities. And then certainly as states are getting those funds and are going to actually administer those funds, looking at applications that do look at those priority areas. And then one other thing that's very interesting is that states are going to have to identify every location that meet the priorities to know where to focus those grants. And so that address level data set is going to be very important. The one thing that is a bit of a challenge is that the fabric that the FCC has a lot of restrictions in terms of the data licensing agreement with the FCC partner that developed it. And so all the states that have been requesting access to the fabric, they have been getting access, but they're not really allowed to use it for anything. you can look at it internally to figure out where you want to challenge it, but you have to have your own address data set in order to do so. And so there's a few different options, and states are kind of at varying levels of what state address data they have to be able to make those challenges. But for the BEAD program, having something in place for that state address level data set to know here are our authoritative locations of where we believe areas are unserved, and then being able to administer the grants that focus on that information. So looking at what's next, and then I'll open it up for questions. So right now, there is an open fabric challenge process. And so the FCC, having made available through licensing agreements, through CostQuest, the vendor that developed the fabric, states and providers are now able to challenge. So if there are missing locations, we've heard from providers and other states and communities that there are entire places that are just missing. There are no address points for certain towns, or there's just missing locations based on how their model worked to build this address data set. And so they're collecting information on where challenges need to be filed. There's 7 different types of challenges on the address data itself. Right now, this has nothing to do with the broadband data. This is literally just on the address component. So one of the other big things that we've been hearing is that perhaps an address is in the wrong location. And that's where providers are becoming concerned. So like if 123 Main Street in the fabric shows up in a provider service area, but 123 Main Street is actually located 500 yards away outside of the provider service area, based on the current fabric, the provider's service area says that they serve 123 Main Street. And so providers are getting very concerned that they're getting tagged as serving certain addresses that they don't actually serve, but it's because the underlying address data is showing it in the wrong spot. And so that's one of the things that providers are seeing with the information that gives them pause about either submitting their broadband data collection information to different states or being able to move forward with it. So right now that challenge process is going on. Back to the statewide level, in late October, there's going to be updated Minnesota broadband maps. So that's something that we are working on right now, finalizing all of the different data that has changed since the last version of the maps were created a few months ago. And so at the end of October, there'll be a new iteration of the broadband map. In mid-November, I put the asterisk here for the national broadband map launch because there is still some uncertainty about if and when it's going to be published. But the FCC has continued, at least as of right now, to say November. And then that is also when the broadband data collection challenge process will start. So the fabric challenge is going on right now, and that will remain open. And then the broadband data collection challenges will end up starting. So you might have challenges on an address location, you might have challenges for where a provider physically serves, and that challenge process will open up as well. And so that's something that states can be looking at. And because Minnesota has a broadband mapping program, that's something that we're going to be able to look at really closely to make sure that areas that are unserved are showing up as unserved, because that information is going to be used for the BEAD allocation. And so the more households you all have that are unserved, that means you all are going to get your fair share of those allocations. And so if we need to make some challenges, that process will start so that we can make those challenges, get things adjudicated, and then make sure that the right areas are listed as unserved. In late December, there's going to be a new version of the fabric released. So that versioning is going to occur every 6 months as well. That's going to start to get into a cycle. And so any challenges received, and there's still a little bit of question about that as well, the fabric challenge process is going to basically remain open all the time. But at some point, in order to create this new version, it's going to have to get cut off. And so some of the challenges that are being received right now can be hopefully adjudicated for this next version, and then that'll continue happening every 6 months moving forward as well. In late March, there's going to be another update to the broadband maps. So that's usually going to be, typically has been in October and March as far as getting the updated maps and information, different analyses. So we'll be working with all the providers starting the very 1st of January to get any updates that they have to their service areas, to their speeds, and make sure those are appropriated for the next broadband map update. And then here I've got TBD just at some point, likely next year, looking at the BEAD allocations because we're not exactly sure when that's going to happen yet. The NTIA is going to be looking at all of the data from the FCC to make those allocations. And then there's also going to be BEAD challenges that states are going to be able to do. So depending on the FCC challenges with the fabric and with the BDC, then there's also going to be a B challenge process. And so as that information comes up, we'll certainly be reviewing that, talking very closely with OBD about what kind of objectives that we would have working together on the data that exists versus what we're seeing with that information there. So now I will open it up to any questions that you all may have.
So, hi Ashley, this is Mark Johnson, member of the task force. Question, you talked about a shot clock with the BEAD funding, I believe. How does the mapping and any delays that we have with the mapping affect the shot clock? Is there any, is there a correlation to that, or does the mapping have to get done by a certain point or have to be cut off at a certain point in order for things to move forward?
So, and this is my understanding, because I'm certainly not with NTIA or a BEAD expert, but it's my understanding there's going to be once the allocations are done, that's when there's a shot clock for when an initial plan has to be developed. And so that shot clock is going to vary state by state. So right now, Louisiana was the first that got announced as far as their planning grant funds, because there's separate funds there too. Each state is eligible for up to $5 million of planning funds to kind of get the process started, and then those BEAD allocations are going to be at least $100 million per state, plus the formula-based service that's based on the map. So there's a couple different funding opportunities that come, and then the larger planning action plans that have to be developed, those have kind of a, 270 days after this is awarded, that's when your plan is due kind of thing. So there's a lot that comes into play there. And certainly the NTIA, the federal program officer for each state has certainly a lot more details on that as well.
Steve Georgie has a question. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm just curious, who's responsible for allowing a local area, community, township to voice their concern about what's being reported on the maps? Is that something that, the Office of Broadband is going to coordinate? Because I've not seen any real outreach. But, if I'm living in that rural township, how do I make sure that it's being properly reported? How do we coordinate that?
So there'll be, there's kind of two different, at least right now, paths forward on there. So there's certainly the state broadband maps, and so looking at that information and data, if there are concerns or discrepancies there, that information can be submitted directly to us and the Office of Broadband Development. Then on the FCC side with the broadband data collection, since those maps have not been released yet, there's also uncertainty about what exactly the data is going to look like that is going to get published. And so that's going to end up being a completely different process. So there will be opportunities for residents, for individuals to challenge the FCC map. And then there's also what they refer to as bulk challenges, where a state or a provider or other local jurisdiction can file with the FCC and say, hey, here's a list of addresses and locations within our county, community, et cetera, that says that they have this provider, but we've done some research, we've done some outreach, they do not, here's our evidence. So there's going to be a path forward for the FCC filing, and then there already exists a process for the state broadband map, any discrepancies that are there.
Questions for Ashley? Okay, well, questions are coming. Ashley, one question I have for you. So have you heard of, there has, for the initial submission, obviously a lot of providers provided kind of their information to the FCC. Have you heard of any challenges for providers in submitting the information? Like the data wasn't correct or wasn't accepted or anything like that?
More on the provider side is where we've heard more of the concerns. So as we've kind of built those provider relationships with state broadband mapping, and they're experiencing issues with actually making their filing, because the Broadband Data Act of 2020 did say, you know, there needed to be a process and assistance for providers that don't have at least 100,000 connections. So any smaller provider could request assistance to say, you know, hey, I don't have GIS as a provider. I don't know how to create these geospatial files I'm required to submit, or do the analysis on the address level data. So that has been a challenge for providers if they don't already have a resource to do that information in-house, working through the FCC help desk to get that accomplished. So we've heard those kind of issues, and then also with the fabric itself, where providers have looked at it and said, you know, we heard from one provider, they were like, 30% of the houses I serve are not in this data set. What do I do? Because they don't want to be misrepresented, because there is so much enforcement and fines and penalties that the FCC will be issuing for providers that file incorrectly or don't file at all. So providers are really nervous about that in terms of looking at it and going, well, hey, this isn't right, but it's not my fault. The underlying address data I have to use is incorrect. And one of the other interesting parts is if a provider does put together kind of that Polygon service area and they upload it to the portal automatically overlays it with the fabric. And so if there are issues in the fabric, then that conversion also will have bad data coming out of it. So the biggest things that we're hearing right now from the providers are that they have concerns. They want to make sure their stuff is right because they don't want to get overbuilt, but at the same time, they also don't want to get fined by the Enforcement Bureau because they have inaccuracies in their data. So there's definitely a lot of concern from the provider community right now.
And then one thing you said was the Minnesota broadband map will be coming out in October or mid-October, somewhere around that, right?
The end of October, yeah.
End of October from Connected Nation. Do you expect a big discrepancy from the national map, or is Minnesota going to be closer to what the reality is? You guys get your thoughts.
I am uncertain at this point. Just hearing some of the challenges that providers have had. There are a few providers in Minnesota that haven't as actively been participating, and so we've been relying on poor census block data that we've been trying to cut back as we do field validation and find areas where the service doesn't actually exist. So there, in that form, I'm hoping that those few providers that still were relying on the poor data, that this data collection will give us an opportunity to clear that part up. But for the remaining parts of providers, it's definitely going to be interesting since the BDC is so focused on the address level data, and the Minnesota broadband map has been more of that service area, the polygons. So it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of combine with each other. And I'm also curious about it on the fixed wireless side, because we traditionally have created fixed wireless propagation models to show, you know, based on tower locations, channel width, frequency, height of the equipment, all these, it's like 24 different factors to actually create where signal strength is probably going to be available. And so having some of that converted to the address level, I feel like that's going to be very interesting as well. And I know I've heard concerns from more of the smaller telcos and cable providers that they're worried about fixed wireless being overstated, because if somebody is just drawing, you know, 3 mile or 5 mile, however many mile buffers around some of their tower locations and then just grabbing all the addresses that are within that, that's certainly going to be very overstated. So definitely very interested to compare data once it is released, but there's a lot of unknowns as far as what the FCC is going to be able to publish, because they are having kind of their own discrepancies and issues with the data licensing for the fabric. So I don't know that they precisely know exactly what's going to be published just yet for everybody to review.
Makes sense. And one of the things the states have to do, you said in the presentation, was they have to almost have to have the list of addresses and what's covered or what's connected and what's not connected. Do you think Minnesota will have a challenge with that, of having that information, or are we in good shape then, just kind of working with the FCC?
I think it will get there. So actually, I've been talking to Diane Wells very closely on some possibilities for the type of address data to bring in to be able to do all types of analyses, whether it's comparing to the fabric or to be able to say, oh, here's the definitive list that we think are the addresses that are unserved and underserved. So you all will be in good shape. It's just not just yet.
Got it. Okay. Other questions for task force members? All right. I'm not seeing any hands go up on virtual. Not seeing any physical hands go up either. So, but Ashley, thank you so much. That was super helpful. Great update, and I'm sure we'll have you on again.
Sure.
This is an important piece of not only the recommendations we make, but also sort of the deployment of broadband in Minnesota. So thank you so much for making time to be here with us today.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to the next topic, we're going to hit on digital equity, which is kind of core to one of the two subgroups that we have. So I believe we have Hannah Butler here with us, who's now responsible for digital equity at the Office of Development. Hannah, are you on?
I am. I'm here in the room.
Perfect. Look at that. Awesome. Good to see you, Hannah. So I will turn it over to you.
Sure. I'm going to share some slides. I know you can see my slides because I can see my slides.
Right.
Minimize this so I don't have to. Okay. So thanks for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to be talking about the Digital Equity Act and also just introducing myself to this group. So a little bit about me. My background is in librarianship. And my background is in librarianship because my cardigan matches the tablecloths in this room, which feels like a distinctly librarian thing to accidentally do. I moved to Minnesota in winter of 2013, very end of the year. It was 36 below on my first day of work at Leech Lake Tribal College at the Beijing-Gabo Library. The library was a frozen pit in the ground, and I was charged with making it into a functional joint-use academic and community library. So stuck with that for 4.5 years. During that time, served as a member on Governor Dayton's task force on broadband. So it's like equally weird and thrilling to be on this side of the task force today. Moved to the cities in 2018 for a job at Hennepin County Library, then spent 3.5 years at State Library Services at the Department of Education, where I administered state aid to regional public library systems, and then joined the Office of Broadband Development at the end of August. So I guess I'm technically now on month 2, but it definitely doesn't feel like it. And so when I am approaching my work here, I always kind of come back to like what it felt like to live in Bemidji and to work at Leech Lake Tribal College, but also what it feels like here to have just driven 5 minutes to get to this meeting from my house. Like, what is this reality? And so this is my go-to illustration of like what rural has meant to me in Minnesota, and it means living over 100 miles from the nearest Red Lobster restaurant. I have no desire ever to eat at Red Lobster, but I think it's just a good metric of like, this is what rural means. Rural means getting really dressed up to drive an hour and a half to eat bad food and an hour and a half home. So I'm happy to be here with the Office of Broadband Development. Like, as you all are aware, just a ton of progress has been made within the last few years on connecting Minnesotans and providing high-speed internet service. That map is just so blue, and I know there are still many areas that require service, but as I look at this now and think back to like when I was applying to be on the task force, the map that I was looking at then, and like the reality that I was living in then, this is just like phenomenal. But there's always what happens next once that connection is available. This is a drone photo of the Leech Lake Tribal College campus. The library is the white building. This was June or July of 2014. the drone that took the photo would later just fly off into the woods and was never seen again. So this is kind of a relic, this photo. There will never be another one like it. When I think about what exists beyond broadband availability, I think of this image and of the students who we saw coming into the library at Leech Lake Tribal College and the community members who came into the library. There was a spring or fall semester where I surveyed our new students and asked them, do you have internet access at home that's good enough? Do you have a computer that works and has what you need on it? And 2/3 of students had internet access at home and half of students had a computer that worked. So even though this would be a dark blue area on that map, it's still an area where so many people don't have access to what they need. So when I'm thinking about digital inclusion and digital equity, the word we are kind of drawn to is digital divide. And that's a word that, or a phrase that this position I'm in is really trying to get away from in a lot of ways. There's this fantastic article that we'll all have access to later called Trapped in the Digital Divide, the Distributive Paradigm in Community Informatics. And in this study that's covered in this article, the researcher, Dr. Virginia Eubanks, doodled the digital divide, that's her phrase, while talking to people who were having difficulty getting devices or accessing the internet. And so her goal was to figure out and visualize the actual complexities of what digital divide means. So here's the kind of assumed definition of digital divide. There are the people who have access, and then there are the people who don't have access, and there's a gap in between, and there's one smooth, clean arrow that gets us from one group to the other group. And there are, there's chuckling in the room because it's never that simple. It's way more than that. So these are the diagrams that she came up with while talking to people and asking them about their experiences in trying to access and continue to access technology in ways that were meaningful to them. So digital divide is like a yes or a no, a kind of an artificial separation. It implies there's one clean solution that's going to just, in one swift movement, will just move everyone from one thing to the other. When in reality, the situation is way more complex than that. People's lives are more complex than just one single line. And the point she makes that I appreciate most is that networked communications are complex just in the way that they work, in the infrastructure itself. And so the solutions to providing connections for people need to be equally as complex. It's not just one smooth.
No one size fits all.
No one size fits all, no. As much as that would simplify things. So the definitions I'm working with in this position and then with the Digital Equity Act too come from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Digital equity, which is described as a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. It's necessary for civic and cultural participation, employment, lifelong learning, and access to essential services. So digital equity is the condition, the place we're trying to reach, it's the goal. And then digital inclusion are the activities that get us to that goal. So activities like affordable, robust broadband internet service, an internet-enabled device that meets the needs of the user, access to digital literacy training, quality technical support, and applications and online content designed to enable and encourage self-sufficiency, participation, and collaboration. And so when we visualize these definitions, digital inclusion turns into this stool, a three-legged stool, because if it only has two legs, it's not going to stand, and if it has four legs, it's always going to wobble. So one of those legs is skills and support, another one is that internet connection, and then the third one is devices and applications. But when I look at this stool and I think about working in public libraries and trying to help individuals access the information they need using technology, there are all these questions that come to mind about this stool, who's using this and why are they using it, and maybe why aren't they using it? is one stool enough for whatever their needs are? Would they benefit from a seat back? Maybe they want armrests. Like, there's no reason a person should be limited to just one very hard, I'm told this is birch, according to the internet, a birch wood stool. What is this stool standing on too? This, like, every time I see this presented, the stool is just like floating in the air. But what is it, like, what is the ground made of? What is the stool made of? Who built this stool? Is this stool sturdy, or is it going to collapse the moment that you set anything on top of it? This is the extent of my drawing abilities, that horizontal line, but I tried. So these are the, like, complex solutions for complex problems questions again. It's who's using the stool, what is the stool standing on, and is the stool sturdy? So, like, who's using these technologies? What are they using them for? And are the solutions in place sustainable and relevant? So the ground there is a ground made of safety and relevance. If a person doesn't feel safe or isn't safe using technologies, that's going to make this stool unusable. If those, if it's just not relevant in their life technology, then that stool is not going to be usable. And then trust is the just so important, and it always feels so simple to say it, but in reality, like, of course, that's a lot harder to figure out and put together and write into a grant application or a statewide digital equity plan. But trust is really then what holds all of this together. Trust between an individual who's getting access for the first time and whoever's helping them. Trust between local government and state government, or state government, federal government. Many, many layers of trust. So we'll move now into talking through the basics of the Digital Equity Act. This was included in IIJA. It's complementary to BEAD. So states that won't be able to use BEAD funding for digital equity will still have the Digital Equity Act available to provide digital equity services, and that includes Minnesota. The full program is $2.75 billion, and it's broken into 3 funding areas. There's $60 million in planning grants for states, tribes, and territories, $144 billion in capacity grants for states, tribes, and territories, and then $1.25 billion in competitive grants to local governments, anchor institutions, etc. We're going to talk through each of those 3 categories. For the planning grants, that's $60 million. I think it's 53.4 or 53.6 million is set aside specifically for states, and then a minimum of 3 million is set aside for tribes, and that number will be adjusted based on the number of tribes that apply. In Minnesota, 8 tribes have indicated intent to apply for planning grants: Red Lake, Leech Lake, White Earth, Fond du Lac, Mille Lacs, Prairie Island, Bois Forte, and Lower Sioux. For the planning grant portion, Minnesota gets $881,000. The application for this funding is under review still. So it's been kind of a nice grace period for me to, like, settle into the job a little bit before having to, like, move into a dead sprint. But I don't know when that dead sprint's going to be, which makes it exciting. Once the award is made, we'll have 1 year to prepare this state digital equity plan. Months 1 through 8, approximately, will be connecting, listening, facilitating, researching, writing. Month 9, more or less, will be a 30-day public comment period on the draft for the plan. And then after that, revising the plan so that it matches what revisions need to be made. And then go through capacity and competitive, and then come back to the structure of the plan. So for capacity grants, this is what happens after the planning period. These are funds to carry out activities identified in the digital equity plans once that planning grant period ends. There's another application, so we don't just, like, hand in the plan and then receive a check in response. There's going to be another process in between those 2 things. And once the capacity grant funding is approved, we have 5 years to complete the activities associated with this. So planning grants are for planning activities, and capacity grants are most likely going to be subgrants to whoever is identified in the planning grants, local government, I would imagine, anchor institutions, nonprofits, to carry out those necessary digital equity activities. And subgrants, I think, are especially valuable with these capacity grants, thinking back to the idea of trust and like who knows the individual people who are trying to get access, who has the knowledge and the like, background to connect with those people in ways that are safe and relevant and meaningful.
Yeah.
The last category are the competitive grants. This is administered by NTIA, not Office of Broadband. Applications will open a month after the first state capacity grant is awarded or executed, so maybe early 2024. Like Louisiana's got their planning grant underway, but then there's going to be a delay once they turn in their plan. You know, it's like, I feel like there's a timeline, but we also have to throw darts at it. So early 2024, there are 4 grant periods that'll run through late 2028, and lots of unknowns at this point. But I include this just so that you all are aware that, like, we'll have the state process, and then we will have state grants, and then there will also be this additional opportunity through the federal government. The plan itself focuses on covered populations. Covered populations are defined in the Notice of Funding Opportunity as households that are below 150% of the poverty line, aging individuals 60 years or older, incarcerated individuals unless they're incarcerated at federal facilities, veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals with language barriers. A language barrier could be they speak English fluently but aren't literate in English, or they speak a language or are literate in a language other than English. Individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, and rural individuals. There's a very particular definition of rural. So rural is a community under 50,000 people, or a community that's not adjacent to a community of over 50,000 people. Or if a rural community is going to receive a sub-grant, then that rural community has to have fewer than 20,000 people. So there's a big asterisk next to many of these adjectives still. The plan has 15 required components. I was elated earlier this week to find a template and a list in my inbox from Diane, from Tom. So like, I thank the broadband heavens for that. Some of the kind of key components of this plan are a digital equity needs assessment that identifies the barriers faced by these covered populations, an asset inventory including current resources, programs, local plans. There need to be measurable objectives for state digital equity activities. There needs to be outreach and engagement embedded in the planning process, and then also continuing into like how these activities will be carried out. And then also a connection to the BEAD 5-year plan. And this isn't a connection like a footnote. This is like the two plans are prepared where they overlap so that those are in sync. When I look at this list, I see like 5 dissertations, which should be totally conceivable within a year. The question I am being asked most often right now is, what's the plan? What's the plan for the plan? What is the lowercase plan for the uppercase plan? And rather than saying, I'm not entirely sure, I'll say that I'm starting with the invisible pieces of digital inclusion, with building trust, with understanding how this is relevant, with establishing like safety in the way that I use technology, and also like just trying to listen and learn and figure out what to do once there is like ground on which to run. And so today, if I will like turn it over to the group for questions, and if you don't have questions, then you can answer my questions alternatively. So I'm just curious, like from task force members, what insights about digital equity have surprised you in your work or as task force members? And then how do you envision the task force being involved in the planning process? Your questions or your answers?
And I have have some questions for you, but I can answer one of the insights about digital equity. I was on a panel earlier this week, and to me it's so surprising how even the definition of what digital equity is still kind of nebulous for a lot of people. And a lot of times it just goes back down to, well, helping someone pay for their internet at home, right? And it's so much deeper than that, but that's sort of where it might stop. So even have some work on educating and making others aware of what equity really is.
Thank you for that.
And this is Mark Johnson, and I think we talked in our subgroup because we had you talk there. But you know, one of the surprises for me being involved in education, right? And so when the pandemic hit and everything, we had to make that pivot. All those things that everybody knows about. We were surprised at how many, you know, and we're in a relatively rural area, but we were surprised at how many families with kids didn't have adequate broadband who were in areas that actually were served. And that surprised us. And we had to look, when you talk about relevance and some of those kinds of things, how deeply we had to look at why is that? What are the reasons for that? Is it, and, you know, and the many reasons that there were are some of those things within digital equity. Like, you know, was it affordability? Was it just a lack of understanding what was available to them? Was it all of those different things? We were very surprised by that. So I think that speaks to what you're talking about in terms of that, the complexity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
And I have a question for you. I love the three pillars, the additional things you had to the pillars around safety, relevance, and trust. Do you have any ideas or some thoughts on why there might be distrust?
The sound cut out during your last 2 words there.
Oh, okay. Any ideas on what might create distrust? Right? Why would somebody not trust? Is it just if you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts around that. So, when we're talking about digital equity, we're ultimately talking about individual people rather than the technology itself. And so we're talking about their experiences with technology and their experiences throughout their lives and that individual context that has led them to this point of having or not having a smartphone or having or not having an internet connection. And so along that path of their individual experiences, trust could be hard to come by, maybe because they have been part of assistance programs in the past that haven't worked for them or that have been really hard to navigate. Or they had, not a great experience in school and now see the use of technology as more learning and more school. And public libraries can be a great place for people to get access and, meet up with someone from the community to get assistance. But there's that stigma that might be attached to where it's a public institution. An individual who has tried to communicate their needs in the past, but maybe has had difficulty because of a language barrier, is going to have a hard time just inherently trusting this process. And so because this is such an individualized area, the things that create trust are individuals. I think of the digital navigator model and of public libraries where the staff is from the community that's being served. And it's that individual one-on-one connection that creates the most trust.
Yeah. Yvonne has a question. Go ahead, Yvonne.
I had the privilege of hearing Hannah speak to our subgroup earlier, and I talked about one of the things that surprised me was the relevance piece, as we were exploring. And then I wanted to recommend a book. It's called The Trust Edge, and it breaks down trust into 8 components that might be helpful. The author is David Horsiger, called The Trust Edge. And it breaks down the trust into quantifiable things that you can think, well, not quantifiable, but semi-quantifiable things that you can think about as you're thinking about that trust piece of the stool.
Thank you for the recommendation. I love a good book recommendation.
Yeah.
Other questions for Hannah? Or you?
I just want to reflect on the last kind of question posed here is how do we envision the task force being involved in the planning process? That's a question you raised before. Broadband thoughts on together the 5-year plan. The task force Broadband Coalition. Question weeks ago.
Your audio
Okay.
isn't coming.
Steve, your audio's not coming through. I don't know if it's just us or if it's for everybody, but we're missing a lot of what you're saying.
That's my great service, probably, but they'll remain nameless today.
Sounds
So
maybe now.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, try again.
Okay. So that last question, how is the task force going to be involved? I've raised this before. The Office of Broadband is charged with developing a 5-year plan. How is the task force going to be engaged with that? I don't know if it's a question we can answer as a task force or if it's we need to hear from the Office of Broadband what their thoughts are, and I think perhaps they're waiting to get a director to do that. But we had a forum with the Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition 2 weeks ago, and that same question was raised as to how do they get engaged in the 5-year planning process. And I think the digital equity, is part and parcel of that 5-year plan. So.
Yeah, every word of that.
Yep, we did. And I would say kind of like Steve is saying, it's let us know too how when you need help, how can we help? Is it something you want us as a task force or as our subgroup or both to bring up as a regular? Do you want to be a regular participant in that and having those conversations? I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and it's speaking for myself, not necessarily for the entire task force, mind you. But I would look for, and I think there are many of my colleagues on the task force would look for opportunities. So if you have opportunities for us to participate, by all means, let us know, because we can certainly make that a topic, at meetings or at subgroup meetings, or whatever, to kind of help with whatever particular process it is. Many people on the task force have, know people, right, in lots of different areas, and so can be a resource for that if you need it, right? And if you don't need it, you don't need it. So just some thoughts off the top of my head.
I would add one thing to that, Mark. As an outside observer, all of the task force members are in their own communities around the state in various places, and those connections Mark just referred to are one of the many assets they bring to the work of the task force. But the recognition of what needs are on the front lines in all of those places that they live and work in their daily lives are exactly what I think you're looking for, being at the front lines and understanding what those individual communities are all about. So the task force members, wherever they are across the state, are a great conduit to those folks in their communities.
Yeah, this is Diane, and I would just say on behalf of the office, we are required to meet with stakeholders for the development of both plans. And so I think what you'll see is participation, like Scott said, Mark, from the education perspective, Steve from the small government, Jim from libraries, and having input in both the digital equity plan and the infrastructure, the BEAD plans, those organizations. But then also we can probably set up a way to share back what we're hearing, and then as a group, it'll be important, I think, for the task force to synthesize and help interpret from your varied backgrounds, you know, whether something is making sense or how best to move the whole state forward, given what we're hearing from the individual stakeholders.
This is Steve Fensky. I guess one question I have is, how do we quantify it? How do we know that whatever we're doing is successful? I don't know how to measure it, you know. Some of the challenges have been talked about, but how do we know that any of the time and money we're putting towards it, how effective is it? If we get access to everybody, are they deciding to subscribe, or is it just in the ground and nobody's using it? A lot of our members in our townships are kind of, some of them are just, they do not want to touch a computer. They do not want a smartphone. It just becomes a choice to avoid it. So I'm not sure. Maybe the task force role is we look at what resources are available and locally, so it's not just the office, not just OBD, but what resources are locally available and provide that. But also, how do we review? How do we know that any of it is working?
Well, I think that's one of the things for digital equity. One of the requirements is to look at what's already being done and then gauge whether that's been successful. So that's part of what will be developed in the digital equity plan. And then input and listening to people that haven't adopted it and why, and then trying to figure out which of these programs to address digital equity, because there's a lot of national resources on this, you know, might work in that population or in that situation. Because you're going to have to decide that in the plan, what you think is going to work, because that'll drive where you award capacity grants. And then in terms of the infrastructure piece, yes, there are people that are just not going to adopt, and the argument there is, well, if you ever want to, you know, sell your property, talk to a realtor. If you don't have internet, you're not going to get a good price for your property. And you know, the pandemic has helped point out more and more need for it. And, you know, the governments are, you know, we moved. It's like, do you want to sign up to get your property tax statement online and do your payments online? I mean, so much of that is moving. It is just taking the right application to get somebody to change. But yes, it goes back to the trust issue, and part of the trust issue is I'm not going to touch the internet because that means Big Brother is watching me. You know, it's really hard to overcome that. And that's a fair choice. They don't have to. But what we'll do is try to drive the resources to those that are demanding it too.
Choice is the important factor there. Like whether a person can choose to use a smartphone or not, or to subscribe to the internet or not. Like if that choice is fully available to them, that seems like a success in itself.
So that part of it, Steve, I think is going to be much more qualitative as opposed to quantitative. And we'll have to incorporate that into the process so that when you get that answer from somebody, you're actually able to record it and demonstrate 400 people said, we don't want it because it's qualitative. The because is qualitative.
Any other questions or comments with respect to digital equity? All right. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. Good conversation. I mean, I think you sparked some interest from different task force members, as well as kind of give us a little bit of an insight on how we might put some of the recommendations together, not only just for this year, but the next year and the following task force. You know, digital equity for sure is going to be a big piece of the next chapter of broadband, right? So I think that's going to be exciting. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so it's 11:24. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11:35, and we'll be back up with Diane giving us an update.